What do you make of these numbers? They seem a little bit weaker than expected.
Yeah, I mean, the contraction in and of itself was in line with expectations. If you look at the subcomponents, based on what I can see, the contraction in consumption was slightly smaller than expected, whereas the slowdown in CapEx was bigger. So that seems to be one source of the downside surprise. So, yeah, overall, I think there's not much new information in here. You know, we did know that there was a third wave in SOE that affected consumption earlier this year. The problem for Japan is that these headwinds from the COVID pandemic are continuing. We're still, you know, now we're in the midst of a fourth wave. SOE is ongoing. So I think the worry now is about the lingering downside effects on consumption this quarter and perhaps going forward, depending on the pace of the vaccination.
Yeah, you said it. Very, very slow vaccination right now in Japan. Does that mean that we're risking a second recession?
Yeah, I think the second quarter, we still have a positive, you know, a slight expansion penciled in, but I have to admit the downside risks and the possibility of a negative reading are there. The reason is because, as I mentioned, there's two headwinds that are facing Japan in the short term. The first is this, the state of emergency and the lingering COVID effects. The second issue is actually the manufacturing side. You know, so far, exports and manufacturing activity have been very, very robust. It's been, you know, holding up the recovery amidst this weak consumption. But in the short term, we are facing concerns around supply side shortages, especially in the auto sector. So if, depending on how bad the production numbers get in May and June, we could have a negative reading.
Izumi, how closely are you following the chip story and that potential to further drag on, as you say, the key auto sector?
Yeah, I mean, we know that the biggest impact so far has been felt in the auto sector. It looks like, you know, there's going to be at the very least some modest production cuts as a response to these input shortages. I think the concern is twofold. One is how long, you know, these negative effects on the auto sector linger. Does it normalize by the late summer, as people have been saying? The second issue is whether these shortages broaden beyond autos. There have been some anecdotal stories about this, but we're not seeing in the surveys or definitely in the production numbers that the shortages are broadening outside of autos. So that would be something to look at.
We see the struggle to get on top of the virus continue in Japan. Of course, lots of skeptics about whether Tokyo Olympics will go ahead. Is it a positive or negative having these Olympics, right? Is it going to be hugely detrimental if they don't go ahead, economically speaking?
Yeah, so I've been fielding the Olympics question probably every 5 days these days. You know, I think at this point it's just a matter of whether they go ahead with spectators or not. In the tail risk that the event is canceled, I think the macro impacts are fairly minimal. But obviously, it would have a negative effect on sentiment. So you know, it's not a huge economic impact, but it's definitely not positive for sentiment in markets, at least in the very near term.
Izumi, the Japanese yen has been the worst performing G10 currency so far this year. How much is this helping?
While the degree of you know, depreciation is not enough to move the needle in terms of, I think, really padding up corporate profits, although given that earlier in the year, I think consensus was looking at a much stronger yen. You know, there were concerns about this being a headwind. I think the fact that the yen no longer looks to be a risk, at least for the next couple months, is positive. We think that one driver of this weak yen is the reacceleration of M&A activity after a pause in 2020. So with these kinds of outward flows likely continuing, we actually see dollar yen at 113 by the end of the year.